Greetings everyone, and welcome to the Worcester Art Museum. My name is Katrina Stacy, and I'm the Associate Curator of Education here at WAM. Jon Seydl joined the Worcester Art Museum as the Director of Curatorial Affairs and Curator of European Art in January 2014.
Now, I hope by now most of you have had the chance to see these two wonderful, strange works by the early Rembrandt that are upstairs in the remastered galleries. I mean, I know these works have been surprising, perhaps even unrecognizable as Rembrandt's for many of you, but I think rather than nesting the works in the context of his early career, I really wanted to take them as a springboard to discuss preoccupations that span Rembrandt's life, matters of vulnerability, sympathy, and fallibility. I'd like to find some ways to connect these curious early works to ideas he's exploring decades later, including the magnificent Kenwood Self-Portrait, among his most challenging and beautiful works. A great masterpiece, but one whose meaning I think still eludes us. So my aim today is really to talk about a few aspects of Rembrandt that might help make sense of all of these paintings and at least raise some important questions about them. I mean, these will include Rembrandt's own brand of naturalism, his long-standing interest in old age and human frailties, his constant sense of experimentation, and the significance of vulnerability. Now, if you like certainty, Rembrandt is probably not the artist for you. Just purely in terms of documentation, we have very few writings in his own hand, and those are mostly dry documents about money, something that was of great interest to Rembrandt. He's a colossal success for most of his career, but ends in poverty and on the margins. His biography is enormously complicated, and he worked for 4 decades without stopping, constantly painting, drawing, and making prints. I really think only Picasso can really compare for his achievements in all 3 media. For decades, he had a large studio, and he was such a good teacher and so dominant in his impact on artists that his way of painting came to be widely imitated and often very effectively emulated. So attribution, frankly, can be kind of a nightmare. So that Rembrandt exhibition that Katrina referred to, I worked on in Cleveland a few years ago, sought to sort out some of these questions. I'll leave those matters actually aside for the most part tonight, although I will say just a few words about the Worcester Bartholomew, although I won't be giving you an attribution other than to say that I agree with the broad consensus that it isn't by Rembrandt. I also won't concentrate too much on his biography, although I'm always happy to answer questions. So these two self-portraits, I think, really start to get at Rembrandt's complexity. They cut across his career, they show his immense range. They both speak to the idea of artist as intellect. I mean, neither of the pictures shows himself as an active painter. They are polar opposites in many ways, of age, of paint handling, but also emotional tone. I mean, one is very energetic, the one closer to me, hopeful from the most successful part of his career. It reminds us that by 1632, Rembrandt had established a major practice. He had moved from his hometown of Leiden, where he had started out, to Amsterdam, where he was at the center of a commercial enterprise, surrounded by students and apprentices, skillful at marketing, where he also became a true celebrity. The other troubled and worn, but also strong and direct. I mean, from the famously unsuccessful late career of Rembrandt. I mean, remember, this is an artist who ended his career in financial ruin, overextended, bankrupt, had to sell his house and art collection, basically worked for a corporation. And I would also point out as well the differences in how Rembrandt's handling paint here. The earlier picture, much smoother, tighter. The late picture heavily worked with thick impasto, visible brushwork, showing how his powers of observation haven't faded, nor his skill as a painter. The question I keep asking people is how many of you would have ever guessed these works were by Rembrandt? I think they're actually a really good example of how even Rembrandt did not emerge as a fully formed genius. I don't think anybody would argue these works are masterpieces, but there's really very little debate that these works were painted by Rembrandt. They come from this very, very early moment in his career, a teenager still in Leiden, before he makes the big break in Amsterdam. He's working side by side or very close to Jan Lievens, and they're kind of the Picasso Braque of their days, these two hugely ambitious men making their way as artists and creating different kinds of innovations. But what to me makes them sort of very clearly Rembrandt, first of course the rendering of light. Using that candlelight, pulling figures out of this dark space, exploring deep shadows. The second is his rough manner of painting, certainly not the preferred style in Leiden, but quite characteristic, in fact, of the young artist. I mean, one of the ways that Rembrandt was separating himself from his early training. Another is the interest in the conditions of old age. I mean, Rembrandt is clearly interested in depicting the older men quite naturalistically. He has a lot of curiosity about the wrinkled skin, the roughened hands, how all of that plays with the light. There's an emphasis on those expanding waistlines and crinkling eyes. And while you might question how well the teenager does all of this, or how sympathetic the portrayal is, I think it is important to point out that this kind of representation is quite unusual, although rather characteristic of Rembrandt's interests. And finally, for me, I think the most important is the subject matter. It's part of a series of, devoted to allegories or personifications of the five senses. We have 3 today. 2 are here in a private collection in New York that's generously been lent to us, the Leiden Gallery. But a 3rd is in the Lachenal Museum in Leiden. Allegories are, of course, very common in the artistic production, in artistic production during the Renaissance. They're very, generally very literary, brainy subjects. But allegories, I think, in this way strike me as actually a very unusual choice for a teenaged artist. I mean, especially because what Rembrandt's doing here is not exactly playing to convention. And to see what I mean by that, I mean, let's think about the allegory of sound. And by doing that, let's look at a painting. It comes a little bit earlier, painted further south. Wonderful collaboration in the Prado by Rubens and Bruegel. And here I think we see lots of very common aspects of early modern allegories, where a nude female is the true representation of the allegory, and it's surrounded by all of these attributes of beautiful music and beautiful sounds. Rembrandt, I don't think really knows this painting in particular, with this series, but he certainly knows the conventions as much from prints as anything else. But certainly, this kind of Rubens Bruegel painting, very refined, extremely learned, very much removed from the everyday. And so in this context, Rembrandt's choice is very unusual. This is also a beautiful example of the lies that PowerPoints tell, because the Rembrandt picture is smaller than a sheet of paper, and the Rubens Bruegel picture is a very large, rather large painting. But certainly Rembrandt's choice to be deliberately unrefined, placed very much in the everyday. And just stop for a minute to think about the kind of music these 3 guys are making together. Do you think it's harmonious? Do you think it's in tune? I mean, I think Rembrandt's giving us this unexpected twist to a familiar subject. I mean, injecting a sense of humor and a huge dose of novelty to this allegory. Or for another comparison of allegories of the senses, we can move further south with Ribera's Spanish painter working in Italy, his interpretation of the allegory of touch. So here, Ribera using this more monumental figure, the blind man feeling his way across a bust. Ribera, of course, in the foreground, squeezing in a play for the superiority of painting over sculpture with the painting that the blind man is incapable of seeing, but turned by Rembrandt this allegory of touch into a painful operation by this kind of charlatan barber. So here the gentle humor of the previous allegory, I think, turns a little bit more dark. So let's keep some of these ideas in mind as we step back to another early work. This is a religious subject from the apocryphal book of Tobit. Tobit once rich man, you can see from his garments, but now reduced to poverty and blinded. This comes from a moment in the story where Tobit accuses his wife of stealing an animal, but then realizes that his physical blindness has actually blinded his heart as well, and he begs her for forgiveness. I mean, again, I think we're seeing the work of a very young artist, those exaggerated expressions, those bright colors, the kinds of things that eventually really fall away for Rembrandt. But I think what interests me here really is the intense naturalism that we saw before. I think important to note that kind of intense naturalism in painting isn't something really seen before quite the same way in Dutch painting. That careful description, the wrinkles in the faces. I mean, her skin's more taut, his sagging, those wonderful blue veins in Tobit's hands, her hands roughened from work, and the intense interest in the conditions of poverty. So those shoes, the patches on that cloak that was once quite luxurious. I think this is really an image about despair and remorse, about Tobit seeking forgiveness, about the loss and regaining of faith. and certainly a work that calls attention to human failings, but played out through this intense naturalism, though I think here with a bigger heart than the allegories we looked at before. I think by now you're getting the sense that Rembrandt is an artist who, even as a very young man, shows a remarkable sensitivity and interest in old age. I mean, literally half of his works from his early years are images of old age. This is incredibly unusual in the 17th century. I think these two works here exemplify a type of work pioneered by Rembrandt, these single-figure character studies, a kind of fantasy portrait. In Dutch, the word is called tronie, which really means just face. But they're obviously kinds of pictures that are based on close study of a model, but they're not really meant to show a known sitter. They're ways to explore facial expressions, fall of light on skin and clothing, and they're really popular among collectors. And painting from life, keep in mind, was absolutely critical for Rembrandt. I mean, we know from all kinds of documents that and from looking at the works themselves, that he used people in his workshop, he used professional models, he used members of the household, family, and Rembrandt, of course, himself in the mirror. Certainly this notion of the tronie and this type of painting comes out of a taste in the Netherlands for the humble, the ordinary. I think you can also link it to a Protestant taste for the humble and the restrained. But I think for Rembrandt, the faces of these elderly men are what he would have called, and excuse my Dutch pronunciation, schilderachtig, which is a word that is often translated as picturesque, but I think really probably should be translated as something closely more like worthy of being pictured. I think what's also remarkable about these types of paintings is their psychological depth. I mean, their capacity to present old age without resorting to exaggeration or mockery. I mean, they're really extremely humane works. In this way, I think you can see Rembrandt, especially in the Harvard painting, advancing from his juvenilia into a much more profound voice. And I think this is actually where the Worcester picture belongs. I don't think with an attribution necessarily to Rembrandt. That's something that hasn't really held up for a long time, at least in the scholarly literature. But it's a work that I think really can't come from any place else except for Rembrandt's studio, or at least a very, very close follower, in part because of the spirit of sensitivity in the work. I think understanding this painting better should be a lecture for another time, maybe even an Idea Lab presentation. And I'll report back to you once Rita Albertson, Philip Klausmeier, and our conservation labs and I can really look and study this painting with the depth that it really deserves and has not really yet had. In terms of portraiture, Rembrandt breathed new life into the genre, just as Bernini was doing in Italy. He had this great skill, he could match the ambitions and interests of his patrons, but also was very interested in pressing boundaries. I mean, I think paintings like this may seem conventional to some of us now, but they really were incredibly innovative at the time. I mean, these paintings are not about their setting. There's really no setting at all. I mean, their individuality becomes the key characteristic here. Rembrandt much more interested in emphasizing interior states rather than an exterior presentation. But I think Rembrandt also has this incredible ability to capture these moments of interruption for both of these men, and they're incredibly active works that create an energy between us and them. Or consider this woman from the National Gallery. I mean, her dress, on the screen closer to me, I mean, her dress tells us that she's a widow. I find this actually an incredibly strange and moving likeness. It's certainly a painting that's not about beauty or convention, and I brought in another widow portrait just to show how Rembrandt departed from the more conventional norms. I mean, unusually there's no direct eye contact here, but I wouldn't describe this painting really as deferent at all. Instead, I find that she seems, to me at least, unsettled, distracted. I mean, look how she's barely settled in her chair. She leans forward, and she's just completed reading her Bible, but she doesn't actually seem to have gained a lot of comfort from it. I mean, in this way, I think Rembrandt is an artist who embraces fallibility and doubt. I mean, this is a woman whose brain is clearly at work, but her mind is not at rest. There's this very interesting tension with this tense grip that she has on her spectacles, while the book seems to be sliding off of her lap. It's weighty, uncomfortable. And keep in mind, a work like this certainly would have been a commission. So on some level, it was a kind of collaboration between this sitter and the artist. And I can think of few other works that bring this kind of depth of understanding to this particular state of being bereft and alone. Rembrandt also brought this kind of insight to images of poverty. We've already seen glimpses of this, for example, in the Tobit and Anna painting. But here, I think, again, Rembrandt looking deeply both at the surface of things as well as into the psychological interior. And I think, here again, I'm comparing Rembrandt's work to a more conventional, popular print at the right, work that reduces the poor to stereotypes. I mean, the inscription below, reinforces how they're being held up really for moralizing purposes or even for humor. Whereas Rembrandt's approach, much more humanizing, down to earth, free of judgment, and focusing on the man's discouraged expression, slumped back, exhausted state. I don't think we could look at this as a portrait or a typology. I mean, I think this print embodies, in many ways, human imperfections. I mean, even Rembrandt's technique, this etching that he's using here, creates this softer, more ragged line. And his very technique even creates this empathy for marginalized people. It's really virtually without precedent, I think it's fair to say, in the visual arts. So it's probably no surprise that as Rembrandt developed as an artist, he began to apply these kinds of sensitivities to narrative painting. So consider Jeremiah, a story from the Old Testament, again, an elderly man at the core of the story, but perhaps more important, contemplation rather than action becomes the subject. So typically for Rembrandt, while many of the stories, if you read the Bible, many of these details come right out of the story, from the books of Jeremiah and Lamentations, but he doesn't follow the Bible literally. And here, combining Jeremiah's prophecy of the ruin brought by the Jews' lack of faith with this deep contemplation of the disaster. And he really reverses the expected way this story was told by placing this complex kind of internalization of mourning at the center, or reducing, if you can barely see it in the background, the drama of Jerusalem's destruction is reduced to this small corner. And when seen side by side with the Tobit painting, you can see very clearly the advance that Rembrandt's made in just a few years. Placing introspection over this kind of didactic storytelling. And so the anecdote, in a way, falls back in favor of this emotional depth. Another innovation with his storytelling comes in his first major mythological painting, Andromeda. So Andromeda, I think many of you know, this princess sacrificed to a sea monster. She's rescued by Perseus. Artists love this story in the early modern period. It allows for drama. There's a heroic rescue. There's a flying horse. It's a great excuse to depict a monster, and above all, a female nude. And so in this light, compared to the print certainly, Rembrandt's reinterpretation is startling in its novelty, concentrating entirely on Andromeda, eliminating the monster and the rescue. And this woman is real. You can feel, and I will get back to the larger screen, you can really feel the weight of her belly, the stretch of her skin under her arm and around her neck, that knitted brow. This is no mythological ideal. And then Rembrandt really, I think, understands how much more powerful this kind of picture becomes by accentuating her fear, the suspense. He lets us empathize with her and makes us realize that her feelings, not this actually dramatic story, are actually the important thing in Andromeda. It certainly, why does he do this? It certainly enhances the vulnerability of Andromeda, but I think it's a painting it's important to recognize is fully aware of its innovation. Rembrandt is an incredibly competitive artist, and his capacity to create these true-to-life images, that's his hallmark. Especially when he learned to put that technique, that talent, to narrative ends. And so I think this work is also meant to draw attention to this new kind of storytelling. It's very showy in that respect. He pushes this idea even further with the two incredibly original prints where he's continuing this process of rethinking the female nude. Here presenting the mythological subject of Diana, the goddess of the hunt, at her bath. And now he's pushing that naturalism even further than he did with Andromeda. He's not concealing any of the lumps in her body, that double chin. He shows cellulite in her legs. And in fact, we can only really identify her as a goddess from the quiver. I don't know if you can even really see that sort of next to her hands. It's really diminished in this print. And like the print of the beggar, here again he's using the relatively new medium of etching, which allowed him to print these much more soft lines in a way that it accentuated and drew attention to the softness of her flesh. Even more startling is this seated nude, which takes the ideas in Andromeda and Diana even further. I mean, this is really a radical reworking of one of the bread and butter subjects in Western art, the female nude. I mean, this body is extraordinary. I mean, emphasized, by those complex and varied lines that Rembrandt's able to make with etching. I mean, essentially, etching is like drawing in a way on a copper plate. I mean, this sagging belly, the lumpy flesh rolling around her knees. I mean, it takes us very, very far away from an ideal body. Now, some scholars have argued that this body type was considered attractive. But I think, and I really agree with Mariette Westermann's interpretation here, that this work, it's hard to argue that this work displays this kind of passionate love of a kind of conventional beauty. I mean, it's so aggressively anti-classical. It's all about accentuating her weightiness, her awkwardness, and it's quite deliberately irregular in all kinds of ways. I mean, look at her breasts, that tug of skin on her neck, that strange position of her arm. I mean, the market for these prints is, it's actually pretty elusive. We don't quite know. Although we do know that there were collectors out there who really understood Rembrandt's aims and liked that he was really pushing the envelope in all kinds of ways. We also know that there were Dutch viewers at the time and later on that found this work sort of ongoingly as a disturbing thing. So consider what this man, André Pels, who's a kind of theorist writer, said in 1681 about this print. So, quote, "When he would make a female nude, he chose no Greek Venus as his model, but a washerwoman or a peat trader from a barn, naming his error truth to nature and everything else idle decoration. Flabby breasts, distorted hands, yes, even the marks of corset lacing on the stomach and of the stockings around the legs must all be followed or nature was not satisfied." So I think really pushing things much further than Diana. I mean, Rembrandt completely abandons narrative here. There's no excuse given for this nude in myth. I mean, even the outdoor setting, I find, doesn't let us see her as a studio model. But I think even if this print was meant to be shocking, I don't think Rembrandt meant it in any way to be mocking. I mean, I think it's really actually quite sympathetic to the reality of the flawed human body. And in his drawings, Rembrandt could also bring extraordinary sensitivity to these scenes of daily life. So consider this as one, a tender drawing of his wife Saskia. It's very easy for me to imagine Rembrandt sitting in the room with her, this late afternoon light captured with these strokes of wash, observing his wife, who's weakened, we know, from her recent pregnancy. And he creates this these senses of intimacy with details like that seat on the floor, in the foreground, and that would have been for her wet nurse, but here it's empty, clearly sent out of the room so that Rembrandt and Saskia could have privacy, and this quality, this intimacy beautifully captured by the drawing. Now with this work, which lives nearby at the MFA, Boston, a lot of you know this painting, it's very small, we move into a different world. I mean, this is quite elusive in its meaning, but certainly a work that's about the creation of art. It's not exactly a self-portrait, although you will often read that in the literature. I mean, it's not a likeness of Rembrandt, a face we know very, very well. But it's impossible to imagine in a work like this that Rembrandt isn't saying something important about his own practice as an artist. So here we have an artist in isolation, in a room at the top of the stairs. It's brightly lit from this window at the left with the door closed. It's a door that has always seemed to me to be bolted shut. Has only the barest essentials. I mean, basically, very basic materials for painting in the background, and then only some cracking plaster and empty easels on the wall. No sign of students, models, props. At the center of the painting, a wooden panel is on an easel, looming. I mean, it casts this dark shadow, even blocks the path to the door. So the artist is confronting his work, but it's actually a work that we're prevented from seeing. Now, most people have interpreted this work as Rembrandt's statement about how art should be made. That is, great art is formed in the mind's eye before ever starting to actually paint. Art is something that doesn't come from imitating nature or from constant practice. And I don't really disagree with any of that. But I think something more complicated than that is also happening here. First of all, I think it's really important that we can't see the panel. So I've always wondered, is the artist stepping back to scrutinize his work, or is he plotting his first move? Or is he stuck and incapable of even starting? I mean, the painter himself contributes to this ambiguity, and he seems almost overwhelmed by that smock and the painting's scale. I mean, to me, that shadowed face, too, has this expression that's as much about anxiety as contemplation. And, Rembrandt, in a way, creates this triangular wedge between the easel and the artist. I mean, this painting, to me, almost becomes this kind of looming force field. This division, between the artist and the panel, accentuated by the cracks on the floor, the bright line marking the painting's edge, that bright white line. So this mysterious, huge picture confronts this artist. It seems overwhelmed or even a little bit disoriented. And I think a drawing he made a year later actually underscores my interpretation, because here I think you see the terms have changed. I mean, the vertical format, now the artist is intensely leaning forward. I think here there's no question that the artist is making a careful assessment of his work, and the artist is really in control. But in the Boston painting, the artist almost seems to be wavering. I mean, in my view, it's always been a quite moving and almost unprecedented embrace of the artist's doubt, his fallibility, his concerns. So now to the self-portraits themselves. So here he's grimacing, looking kind of goofy, smoldering, glaring at us, speaking to us, and looking kind of sad. And there are few artists who examine themselves so intensely throughout their career. And I think it's really fair to say that there's no visual artist in the 1600s who applied this kind of self-scrutiny over such a long time. So first, let's consider the varied reasons he made these self-portraits at all. I mean, the study of the face, as I alluded to before with the Tronies, was at the heart of Rembrandt's practice. I mean, it's this valuable exercise for him, and so you see this range of emotions. And of course, Rembrandt, you couldn't be a better model. He's always available, he works for free, he did exactly what the artist wanted at any time of day or night. But I think you do need to see these works as Tronies, those kinds of marketable character studies. And we know, in fact, they were, at least at times, appreciated as images of celebrity. I mean, people wanted, pictures of Rembrandt. He's a famous guy. Rembrandt's also somebody who projected himself into different kinds of guises in his portraits. So here is a kind of Renaissance courtier, linked to Italian Renaissance painting, kind of historical hero here with this Indonesian sword we know that was in his own collection. Here as a kind of a miserable beggar. Here, along with his wife Saskia, this is the hard partying prodigal son. Or then very late work, an extremely moving view of himself as the Apostle Paul. But you'll notice in all of those works, and there are so many more I didn't show, he never presents himself as an artist. So you have this remarkable sea change for Rembrandt in the 1660s, where now for the first time he shows himself as an active painter. In the 1600s, many artists were reluctant to present themselves as painters. I mean, there was a lot about wanting to separate themselves from the craft of painting, its manual side. So Rubens, for example, is accentuating his status as a gentleman, that remarkable setting, the clothing he's wearing, the sword. We also see him from below as, Rubens grandly, elegantly rises above us. I mean, that being said, there is a tradition in Rembrandt's day with artists showing themselves as artists. And here's just one example by a painter, Netscher, although I've always been amused because this palette looks like it's never been touched. And here, I think Netscher's seeking to elevate his status like Rubens through many of the same elements, that setting, the clothing, the pose. And you can see, on the table, there are these allegorical symbols of the arts. Certainly Netscher showing painting as an intellectual and very well remunerated endeavor. It's actually hard to imagine this guy even working. But Rembrandt's doing, of course, exactly the opposite. I mean, he's calling attention to his simple cap, those working clothes. He puts us on the same plane where Rembrandt looks directly out at us. And when you look at the painting with X-rays, it's actually quite interesting because Rembrandt clearly began by showing himself, you can see on the right of the X-ray, actively painting. There's an arm there. But he steps back from that initial idea to show himself, holding the maul stick, the brushes, and that palette. His clothes are actually a little bit difficult to decipher. I mean, it seems to be a kind of smock that we know Rembrandt wore while he was painting, but those red and white layers underneath are kind of, Renaissance-ish clothing. I mean, it gives him this kind of formal and certainly an imaginary quality. I mean, this is a painting that's not documenting his practice. This isn't just Rembrandt looking in a mirror. And I think, Rembrandt's change from the X-ray too, really is interested in creating this powerful pyramid form. I mean, it's also turned to, confront us quite directly. I've also found, and this is a painting that lives at the Ivy Bequest outside of London, but it's traveled to a lot of different exhibitions over time. So many of you may have had the opportunity to see it. Certainly a painting I would put in the category of a work you need to see before you die. It's really, the PowerPoint does absolutely no justice to the work. I mean, it's really, truly extraordinary. But that passage of the palette and the brushes, I mean, it's really amazing. It's barely sketched in. It's the most painterly aspect, in fact, of the entire composition. But I think, it draws attention to itself not because of how accurately it depicts the act of painting, but because it's so clearly made out of paint. I mean, it's this palette, interestingly, in contrast to Netscher, it seems to have actually no paint on it at all for Rembrandt to use. But it's so obviously constructed from these kind of visible slashes of pigment. I mean, it almost obliterates the painting hand, turning it into the single brushiest part of the work. The paintings, often has been described as unfinished, but I think that really kind of misunderstands the work. I don't even really know what finished would mean in this context, since the work wasn't really made. We know it wasn't made for a client. It's incredibly painterly. It's being built up with all these kinds of impastos, the scratching in of lines, these very broad strokes. It's a style that I think it's important to point out in the 1660s that could not be more, it's almost perversely unfashionable. So when you look at a painting by Van der Helst, I mean, that's what people in Amsterdam wanted, that very polished, bright, colorful, slick painting. Not what Rembrandt's doing. And those enigmatic circles, I mean, they're a really critical part of what makes this portrait so unusual, powerful. And, it would really be hard to overestimate how much scholars have struggled to interpret those arcs in the background. A lot of these theories are actually, I think, pretty easy to dismiss. They're just abstract forms that have no meaning at all that Rembrandt did just to fill the space. I think we could pass on that. Another scholar saw them as occult symbols related to the Kabbalah. I feel okay letting that one go. Some of the ideas I think need to be taken actually quite seriously. So one scholar, Jan Emmons, in the 70s, read the arcs in the background as symbols tied to contemporary art theory, just presented in a much more abstract way. So the circle on the left stood for theory, and the standard symbol for that is the compass. But so instead of showing the compass, he creates a circle made by a compass. While the circle on the right, which in this idea, this construction stands for practice, symbolized by the compass and the ruler together in this sort of standard European symbol, language of symbols. And then Rembrandt standing in between those two approaches of art and theory, of practice and theory. Rembrandt becomes then this embodiment of inborn talent. Although I have to say that kind of blunt language of symbols wasn't really Rembrandt's way. Others have argued that they represent a map, which might explain that sag. And let me just see if I can. Katrina, do I have a pointer here? I do not. Okay. Well, I'll use the mouse. Yes. So this little passage here, that some have seen as a kind of sag in the background, as a canvas or a map. And the maps are something you certainly see in the background of a lot of Dutch paintings. Vermeer being absolutely the most famous of these. And Perry Chapman, a great scholar of Rembrandt, for her the maps really mean worldliness and fame, and she sees them as a sign of Rembrandt's universality. Rembrandt summing up his life's accomplishments with his identity wrapped up in the mastery of his art. Rembrandt's certainly aware of this symbolic use of maps. He used it himself in this early double portrait, which he lives at the Gardener, probably to indicate wealth, worldliness. But I hesitate with this interpretation because, in this, I hope it's not too obvious to say, but it doesn't really look like a map to me. Another scholar, Bros, floated an idea that gets us, I think, actually a lot closer. And he gets there by looking closely at one of Rembrandt's most puzzling works that has a very similar form, here on the back wall. It's a portrait of a famous calligrapher, a guy named Copenhagen. And keep in mind, the 17th century is this moment when calligraphy is really coming into its own. It's increasingly understood as a kind of independent art form of its own. And Rembrandt's doing a portrait, of someone I think that should be understood as an artist. But I think it's really interesting that Rembrandt doesn't show Copenhagen creating that kind of intricate work for which he was famous, and that's the example I'm showing you here, but just as a single circle on a sheet. Maybe it looks a little bit like an oval, but I think it's distorted through perspective. So why would you even present calligraphy like this? I mean, the closed circle, I think many of you know, had long been associated with perfection, eternity, this line without beginning or end. This is a Christian and a secular tradition in the West. And in the Netherlands, the perfect circle came up in a very famous book of artist biographies by Vasari. And this is a kind of book that Rembrandt certainly would have known well. And there's a story about the early Italian Renaissance painter Giotto, who was asked to prove his skill to the Pope. And to prove his skill, he makes a perfect freehand circle with one flick of the wrist. And as a result, through the story, the perfect circle became this well-known symbol of artistic skill. And you can imagine that this notion was particularly potent in the world of calligraphers. So this, and therefore, in Copenhagen's own work, he presents a print of his calligraphy in this way. I think the easy interpretation is then that Rembrandt's making a statement about his artistic excellence, placing himself alongside the greatest painters. But then why are the circles so incomplete? I mean, I think it's quite striking how Rembrandt seems to embrace and undermine this interpretation at the same time. I mean, there isn't one circle, there are two. Neither of them are finished. I don't think either of them, especially when you see this painting in person, that they don't seem particularly perfect. I mean, they're made out of very obviously uneven strokes of paint. I mean, I've always been struck by how he makes it very clear that they're created by multiple strokes. So undermining the anecdote in a very, very fundamental way. So as we conclude, consider the circumstances of this portrait. I'm one of those people who's always suspicious of biographical interpretations, but I think the context is important here. So remember, Rembrandt declares bankruptcy in 1656. He auctions his possessions during this horrible recession. He moves to a small rental on the outside of Amsterdam. In 1660, he's basically the principal employee of a dealership that's owned by his son and common-law wife. 1663, Hendrika, his common-law wife, had died. His studio now shrank to literally one other person. There's no signature on this painting, which I think underscores the fact that he's now painting largely for himself. Certainly, this is not a portrait that accounts for his success or his happiness. But it is a work, I think, deeply sympathetic to his own old age. It's in no way idealizing. There's broken blood vessels in the face, age spots, jowly chin. Startling, especially in person, in its naturalism. And that expression, which I find incredibly moving, dignified, but has no illusions of power. Confidence, was never an issue for Rembrandt, but I find it very hard to read this expression in any way as commanding or triumphant or heroic. It just doesn't jive with what I see here. It's a work that's deeply introspective, entirely mortal, and in a way recalls his humane and compassionate approach to portraiture, to the aging body and to the real body that he began to explore 4 decades earlier in pictures like the two we have upstairs. I think this work also recalls his interest in privileging introspection over a clear narrative. It's a painting, in other words, that presents his own failings and accomplishments at once. He's an artist strong enough in a way to attempt the perfect circles, but bold enough to leave them sketchy and incomplete. He's an artist willing to embrace complexity and doubt and lack of completion. And I do think that the early artist in his studio has some traces here, but Rembrandt no longer seems so fearful. Instead of an anxiety about starting the picture, it's more of a willingness to leave it unsigned or incomplete. And this is a perspective really of old age, something I think that can only come from a long history of painting. He's an artist who's still thinking about the boundaries of what's possible to paint, but still with this furrowed brow, he's not shrinking from the capacity to create an image and willing to accept his fallibility. Thank you. Yes. So the comment is that the possibility of interpreting the artist in his studio in Boston as stepping back from his painting and admiring it. Yeah, there are definitely people who would agree with you on that interpretation. It's not the way I see it, but there are definitely many people who would agree with you there. Yeah, so this is about the Rembrandt Research Project, this many-decade attempt to solve the problem of connoisseurship of Rembrandt paintings. I have a lot of thoughts about that. I think it's a really good test case. Well, it's fundamentally a failure, right? I mean, like, they never finished the project. Their methodology changed over time. They recognized partway through that technical art history was actually really important to do. And that their original methodology, I know because I can see documents, and it seems like the same process was used here in Worcester, but I'm still trying to understand more about that. But in Cleveland, I know that they had this process early on where the two members of the committee would come, they would behold the painting, not talk to anybody, not look at any technical information, just behold, and then go and then pronounce. And I don't want to, the people in the committee are incredibly, talented, thoughtful connoisseurs, but Rembrandt's a really, really, really tricky painter, and I guess those are my sort of somewhat incoherent thoughts on that. It's a complicated test case for sure, for connoisseurship, and the sort of the challenges and potential pitfalls in it. So the question about sort of where they fall precisely in his early career, whether he was a student or not. We don't have a precise date on the painting, so that doesn't help us too much. He's someone who seems to break away from his earliest teacher very quickly and sets up independently on his own. There's not really a precise answer to that, but he's someone who's breaking away from his first teacher very quickly. Then goes to Amsterdam, works with Peter Lassmann for a while, but he's not someone who has a long period of training with other
These
artists.
weren't done for a client.
We have no documentation about these paintings, not yet at least. So
These are some of the earliest works.
these are some of the very, very earliest ones. Yeah, the one thing I probably an image I should have brought in is the painting in the Pushkin that is extremely close stylistically to these, that actually has a monogram on it. So there is a very clear comparand of a signature sign painting as well. All right, well, thank you very much, and more questions upstairs.
It's a really big deal because it allows us to firmly date the painting, and there are so few of Van Dyck's early works that bear a date. There's just 7 before this painting, so this is the 8th.